In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the Elven King on a chair of carven wood.
In the book, Thranduil is not fully drawn, so to speak, as a character. In fact, he's not actually named in The Hobbit, except to say that he is the Elven King.
Tolkien doesn't really describe anything more than he's the king of the woodland realm.
But, you know, in a film, you can't quite get away with some of the simplicity that you can in a book, especially a book written for younger people. It has to feel real. And that's one of the rules that we've always given ourselves with these films, is to have our characters have a degree of complexity.
Cate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving and Orlando Bloom created such iconic elves. And so here I had this new elf to play with, and I was thinking, what makes this very powerful king of elves different than them? He's an elf with dungeons. You know, there's a lot to that.
One of the screenwriter's strengths in this film is to actually remain faithful to what's in the book, but nevertheless add all those dimensions to characters like Thranduil.
As filmmakers, we take our clues from Tolkien, obviously, we take our guidance from the book.
The king's cave was his palace, and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies.
Thranduil's underground kingdom in the forest is really an echo or a parallel to this Elven King Thranduil, who's featured in Tolkien's earlier stories. And Thranduil lived in a hill underground in this amazing guarded realm called Menegroth.
For the Woodland Realm, we chose to take that a little bit further and create this king who is now literally in a state where his people are shut off from the outside world.
No one enters this kingdom, and no one leaves it.
If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems.
And so that became an interesting idea. It was like, okay, where did this come from?
The Elven King, the character himself, is inspired by a character from Tolkien's earlier writings, King Thranduil Greycloak.
Thranduil, also like Thranduil, has his weaknesses, and one of them is passion for the jewels, and that was a kind of recurring theme in Tolkien's writing.
And we thought, okay, so maybe that's something that you can turn into a character story.
There are gems in the mountain that I too desire. White gems of pure starlight.
Because we needed to know why he would march upon that mountain without it feeling greedy. So what we decided was that these gems had a meaning for him.
The heirlooms of my people are not lightly forsaken.
In ancient days, they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure.
We've seen all of that in earlier writings that predate The Hobbit. King Thranduil had a great quarrel with the dwarves, which is what Tolkien referred to in The Hobbit.
Thranduil arranges for the dwarves to make a necklace for him, but then there is a dispute over payment and ownership.
Now, there's some real contention as to what exactly happened, but the dwarves actually went in and killed Thranduil in his own halls.
In revenge, the elves go after the dwarves, and they wipe these guys out. So you can understand the intensity of the blood feud between these two races that persists for thousands of years afterwards.
We took that story thread about a dispute over jewels that Professor Tolkien in the Book of the Hobbit ascribes to past grievances and expanded on it. And it began to help us shape Thranduil.
The film did rather well in motivating Thranduil's refusal to help the dwarves when Smaug attacked, and the dwarves' deep resentment of the fact that he refused to help. Well, that's not in the book, but it is, I think, quite consistent with the way that Tolkien presents the elves in particular.
Tolkien clearly was inspired by his own construction of King Thranduil living in the caves in the Great Forest, but we don't know whether the Elven King in The Hobbit was originally intended to be Thranduil or a Thranduil-like character. And it's not until he starts writing the sequel that he decides, no, this is a new character.
We find out his name in The Lord of the Rings when we meet his son, Legolas Greenleaf.
Maigovanen, Legolas Thranduilion.
Govannas Vingwenenle, Haldir Olorien.
One of the things that we got to do in The Hobbit is to bring in the character of Legolas. He's not actually in the book, but I think we would have probably been killed if we hadn't met Legolas in these movies.
Do not think I won't kill you, dwarf.
It's highly likely that Legolas was still living at home with his dad at the events of The Hobbit, and why not have him part of the story, taking advantage of the fact that we have now the full picture of Tolkien's family tree, as it were.
One of the things that was interesting for me about Legolas being a part of The Hobbit was for me to get to go back and create a backstory for Legolas, and particularly the father-son relationship.
Why did you do that? You promised to set him free.
And I did.
Thranduil is really a very complex character, you know. He's an elf with an axe to grind, you know, which is normally a dwarf's job, right?
Stay here, if you will, and rot. 100 years is a mere blink in the life of an elf.
You get the sense when you meet Thranduil that his agendas are so obviously distinct and his superiority is so evident that there's something frightening, and that's a different quality that we haven't seen before in an elven leader.
Thranduil is nefarious, he's duplicitous, he's a commanding individual. All of these elements you would think inform a very clarifying view of a character. They don't. They just make it more and more complex to find that beautiful and refined piece of design that is going to perfectly represent that individual.
We explored all kinds of different ideas for Thranduil back in the days with Guillermo del Toro in the beginning. And one was an Orientalist kind of influence that was coming through in terms of headdresses, in terms of makeup, in terms of costuming.
Some of the ideas I was playing with, because we were sort of pushing this more Orientalist sort of idea, was he's obviously someone really quite stone cold, quite imposing and intimidating, that would have sort of a mantle that could have a slightly armoured feel to it, and a crown that was kind of sort of dangerous looking, quite spiny. We even started playing around with the idea of painting tattoos on their skin, like with the henna painting in some cultures where they paint pattern work onto themselves as a decorative device.
A lot of kooky ideas were cooked up early on because Guillermo inspires people to really go laterally and think broadly. Of course, when Pete came on board, it was important that every character in the movie now complemented his vision for his film. And that required us to revisit the elves.
And have you got any thoughts of an actor that we could base them on? Not that you may have cast someone, but even someone that we could design around the body type.